not merely confined to the gay community. I motion to call the disease Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS.
In 1982, Dr. Harry Haverkos was one of the Centers for Disease Control's epidemiologists tasked with defining AIDS.
AIDS refers to a syndrome, and its definition changes periodically.
AIDS is a chronic disease. It's based on its immunodeficiency.
AIDS is not a disease, right? AIDS is a whole lot of different things. Depends on what country you're in.
When your CD4 count falls below a certain arbitrary level, by definition, you have AIDS.
You know, when someone's count goes down and then it goes back up again, it's, you know, politically they may still have AIDS. Medically, I don't think they do.
If you develop any of a number of opportunistic infections or diseases, that puts you in the category of AIDS.
We don't even know what AIDS is. AIDS is so hard to define because they change the definition of it every year.
The definition of AIDS has broadened over time. It was revised in 1985, and then again in 1987.
The changes in the definition have been political. Every time they change the definition, the numbers go up.
The definition has changed many times. The biggest change was probably in 1993, which they then, added the CD4 count and HIV, and, so you could not even be ill, but if you had a CD4 count consistently below 200, you now had AIDS.
A closer look at the Centers for Disease Control's documents reveals that AIDS numbers actually declined in 1993, but a retroactive definition change increased the estimates by more than 100%.
The more diseases they could lump into this AIDS syndrome, S stands for syndrome, the better the chances are they get patients under that umbrella, the more patients they could catch.
As time goes along, definitions get used for a variety of issues, and some of those are not based solely on scientific decisions, but politics and capitalism and reimbursement comes into play.
For example, a person with hepatitis C, even say here in San Francisco, if you've got hepatitis C and only hepatitis C, you're shit out of luck.
Having an AIDS diagnosis, I get a free apartment. The city of San Diego pays my apartment.
I can have the state of California pay for many medications related to HIV.
I get Social Security benefits.
I can get discounts on my supplements at the local health food store.
I also get food stamps and in-home supportive cleaning services.
So I was basically a healthy person walking around, and yeah, I had all these wonderful little perks, You
get all these benefits, that we fought for and got. But the end result has been a sort of an imbalance. We succeeded, and I'm glad we did, but it is a little unfair.
Politics, insurance, capitalism, benefits, you can be sick or healthy. I never would have thought that AIDS was so convoluted.
Right. Well, as I said, that has changed. How you define that scientifically has changed quite often. Which just makes it difficult to, for the lay people to understand. It makes it difficult for me to interpret the numbers.
Africa is purported to have the highest incidence of AIDS cases on the planet. So I trekked to South Africa to witness firsthand the impact of AIDS on that troubled continent. Around 10 million of South Africa's 48 million people have been reported to have AIDS. It's only a 10-minute drive from Cape Town's pristine modern airport to the squalor of neighborhoods said to be ravaged by AIDS.
All the facts on HIV and AIDS with Griselda on Metro FM Talk.
It's World AIDS Day. There are functions, there are gatherings. The international theme is Stop AIDS, Stop HIV and AIDS. Keep the promise. So many years later, we keep saying the same things, HIV, HIV, HIV. And yet,
each time I hear words like HIV and AIDS, I just want to pull my hair out. I'm just so fatigued about how we've packaged the messaging. All we talk about is AIDS. It's a sex virus. You have to use condoms or you die. It's a sick and sad message. People can't think outside AIDS anymore. And it's just a shocking, sad reality.
The first AIDS meeting on the continent of Africa was in 1985 in Bangui.
We were there with a few people who had experience on AIDS in Africa. And one of our problems was, how can you diagnose AIDS in Africa in the absence of very sophisticated laboratory support?
Even though by 1985 there was a HIV test, most of Africa didn't have access to it. So one of the things that we did in that meeting was to sit down and hash out the so-called Bangui criteria for the diagnosis of AIDS in Africa. The idea was, what would be a simple way for a clinician to look at a patient and say that this patient likely has AIDS?
We say somebody who has a combination of certain signs and symptoms like major weight loss. And if you have a combination of that, you can say this is probably somebody with AIDS.
They wanted a clinical case definition where they could decide that someone had AIDS just by looking at weight loss and persistent fever and so on.
It gave something to clinicians in Africa to diagnose AIDS.
And that helped in the overall effort to count cases, because we needed to know what was the impact of the epidemic.
They could discover AIDS all over Africa at that point. They could say that we are all at risk, but they could say it's spreading around the world. They could say it affects women as much as men, because almost anyone in an African hospital could be diagnosed with AIDS without having to do the HIV test at all.
Whole nations have been led to believe that, in some instances, that they've got large percentages of their population infected and doomed because of this supposed sexually transmitted virus. It's such a tragedy.
Daniel, a lot of people here is very sick and is very dying.
What kind of sickness do you see around here?
It's HIV/AIDS.
What is AIDS?
We don't know. We don't know.
So here you're living in a mud hut, and here some kind of white men with doctors who you respect, and they tell you that there is now among you an invisible disease, and it gets into your blood and can stay there unseen for years, and when it manifests itself, it's going to manifest itself in the forms of disease that you've always known.
Maybe if you look skinny, if you lost weight, maybe they'll simply say hey, you have AIDS, or you're coughing a lot, maybe they'll say you have the disease.
This cannot help but create extraordinary paranoia in people's minds. They say, well, what is going on with us? My neighbor next door he's got malaria. Does that mean that he's actually got this dreadful disease that the whites are talking about?
Like I could be fat now, then the mentality is that if ever I become teen, then it could be one of the symptoms. I have to ask myself, why now? Why at this time?
Dr. Christian Fiala argues that many doctors have misused the Bangui definition.
In the era before AIDS, we had to admit we don't know the diagnosis and we could hypothesize. But nowadays, what doctors do is, well, if we don't know what it is, it must be AIDS.
We did have patients with the conditions we now regard as AIDS defining, even before the advent of AIDS.
People could have TB and not have HIV and fulfill the Bangui criteria. They'd lose weight, they'd have TB, and they could look like they have AIDS when they don't.
Is this Bangui definition still being used today?
I'm fairly certain that in many parts of Africa where there's still little or no testing available, that definition is still used, and I wouldn't be surprised that it's used in the poorer parts of Asia.
This word AIDS, I don't know what it is anymore. I don't know what we're talking about anymore when we talk about AIDS. AIDS is one thing in Greenwich Village and a very different thing in Kampala, Uganda.
I visited the World Health Organization's website searching for answers and discovered there are currently more than 12 different definitions of AIDS worldwide. So I turned to Dr. James Chin, former head of the WHO's Global HIV Statistics Unit, for an explanation.
In some countries, they felt they were a little more sophisticated than in others. And you have, you know, along with the epidemic of HIV, epidemic